Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unearthing a chapter of history that, well, it often gets overlooked, revealing a darker, more intricate side of a colonial power you might not immediately associate with it.
hmm
We're talking about France, its profound entanglement in Southeast Asia, and a particularly potent substance that became the financial engine for much of its colonial enterprise,
Oh,
opium.
this narrative offers a truly compelling challenge to our assumptions about empire. It's not simply a story of territorial expansion or military might,
Right.
but one driven by an economic engine fueled by widespread addiction. This dark legacy, in turn, cast a long shadow, fundamentally contributing to the eventual unraveling and downfall of an empire.
Wow.
We're going to pull back the curtain on how France, often seen through a different historical lens, played a central and devastating role in the global opium trade,
Devastating.
with repercussions that echoed for generations.
Our mission today is to shed light on this lesser-known history, to extract the crucial insights, and to understand the deep impact of these colonial choices, both in the distant lands they governed and back within France itself. By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a dramatically new perspective on the true cost of colonial power, the mechanics of economic exploitation, and the unexpected, often brutal ways history has of coming full circle. #I. The global imperial game and a shifting opium landscape. Okay, let's begin by setting the historical context. The late 19th century was an intensely competitive and ambitious period on the global stage.
Absolutely, a real pressure cooker.
Yeah, it was an era when established European powers, long accustomed to their dominance, suddenly found themselves facing formidable new challengers.
hmm
We saw the emergence of fresh imperial players like the United States, aggressively carving out its own sphere of influence, particularly in the Pacific, following its expansionist
Well,
policy.
flexing their muscles.
Then there was Japan, rapidly industrializing and looking outward, eager to assert its growing power. Even a newly unified German empire, striving to secure its place among the world's leading nations, demanded a slice of the colonial pie, pushing relentlessly for new territories and resources.
Everyone wanted in on the game.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the vast Russian Empire was steadily extending its reach eastward, deep into the Far East. But this aggressive, relentless expansion came at an incredibly steep price, especially for the older European powers who had long dominated the global colonial landscape.
Yeah, the cost.
The cost of maintaining and expanding these sprawling empires was becoming increasingly unsustainable, both financially and in terms of human life.
That's absolutely right. The British Empire, despite its unparalleled vastness and strength, truly bore the heaviest burden, financially, militarily, and in terms of human cost, in this intricate, cutthroat game of global dominance.
The biggest player, the biggest cost.
Definitely. While the French, arguably, seemed to pay a lesser immediate price in direct military outlays, their navigation of this increasingly complex imperial chessboard was, well, far from skillful.
How so?
Consider, for instance, the infamous Scramble for Africa. While it offered vast swaths of territory, it ultimately proved far too expensive to properly administer and exploit, and it came far too late in the imperial race to genuinely provide the economic returns they desperately sought.
Too little, too late, and too expensive.
Precisely. What's profoundly important to grasp about this entire era is the fundamental absence of any real justification for these relentless conquests.
Yeah.
There was no legitimate moral or logical basis for the widespread appropriation of lands, cultures, and peoples. This inherent lack of legitimacy created a permanent, simmering threat of war across the globe, a tension that ultimately escalated into the cataclysm of the First World War, which utterly exhausted all the classical European imperialists, fundamentally and irrevocably altering their power and global influence.
Building on that, this period of intense global imperialism with its new players and escalating costs also dramatically reshaped the very nature of colonial exploitation, particularly when it came to opium.
Ah, yes. Opium.
Before this critical shift, much of the opium trade relied on private farming systems, where individuals or private companies held lucrative licenses to manage its sale and distribution.
The old way.
But as the demands of empire grew and the costs of military expansion mounted, a new guiding principle emerged across the European colonial powers. The immense private profits generated from opium had to be transferred into state bureaucratic monopoly profits.
A huge shift.
This wasn't just a minor administrative tweak, it was a fundamental reorientation of how opium would serve the imperial agenda, becoming a direct financial tool of the state.
So the crucial question becomes, what did this mean in practical terms for the colonies?
Right, what did it look like on the ground?
It signaled a profound shift in power and control. The existing opium import monopolies, which were primarily private with the notable exception of the British in India, who had already established a state-controlled system, were systematically dismantled and replaced by what was known as a Reiji method.
Reiji method.
Yeah, basically a state monopoly system. This Reiji system essentially granted the state a complete ironclad monopoly over opium, leaving no legal space whatsoever for private enterprise in its trade.
So private traders were just out.
Completely out, legally speaking. The only remaining form of free trade in opium once the state monopoly was firmly established was, by definition, smuggling, a pervasive black market operating entirely outside the control of the colonial administration.
Ah, the black market steps in.
Always. This fundamental shift wasn't isolated. It mirrored a broader trend of the time: the rising dominance of powerful, often warring states over private capital. Only a few exceptionally powerful, well-established private monopolies like the Netherlands Trading Society, NHM, in the Dutch East Indies, were robust enough and sufficiently integrated into the state's apparatus to successfully adapt to this aggressive new reality.
There's a staggering shift. So if the state was now directly controlling this incredibly lucrative trade, what was the immediate palpable effect on the ground in the colonies themselves? Did this new Reiji method simply mean more efficient exploitation, or did it fundamentally change the colonial relationship?
Well, both, really. This new state-centric approach to exploitation, heavily influenced by contemporary European political theories, and particularly by a vigorous bourgeois assault on what they viewed as feudal aspirations.
Meaning old power structures.
Exactly. Dismantling old aristocratic, monarchical, and religious claims to power found its ultimate, most brutal proving ground in the colonies.
A testing ground.
A grim one. With the state now directly controlling resources as lucrative as opium, military repression and economic exploitation there increased tremendously. The colonies became laboratories for these new, more centralized and ruthless methods of resource extraction and population control.
Looking at the wider context, all this aggressive expansion and intensified exploitation ultimately culminated in a profoundly bloody and miserable end for the European powers involved.
It couldn't last. Within a mere half-century, the indigenous counterpowers in places like China, India, and Indonesia had mobilized to such an extent that they simply could not be suppressed or destroyed by the colonial forces.
The pushback grew too strong.
Much too strong. The whites, as they were often referred to, were ultimately forced to flee, frequently in chaotic and humiliating retreats. By around 1945, the traditional game of European colonialism was effectively over, signaling a monumental geopolitical shift that irrevocably reshaped the world map and ushered in a new era.
Some colonial powers, it seems, simply couldn't accept that the game was over, or wouldn't accept it.
Denial is a powerful force.
The French and the Dutch stand out as prime examples of this stubborn resistance to the inexorable tide of changing global realities. It took nothing less than the total destruction of their colonial empires through costly and protracted wars to finally force them to confront the new realities of a post-World War II world, where direct colonial rule was no longer tenable.
They clung on desperately.
Often at immense human and financial cost.
What's truly striking here is just how persistent and unyielding the French were in their refusal to acknowledge the end of empire. Their deep-seated commitment to maintaining their colonial possessions was absolute.
Really dug their heels in.
Oh, completely. It demanded two long and devastating wars, first in Indochina, then a brutal conflict in Algeria, and even significant pressure and assistance from the United States before they definitively lost their global standing, not just in Asia, but across their entire empire.
Wow. 2 major wars.
And they underwent a dramatic historical transformation, shifting from triumphant winners of the long 19th century, having built a formidable empire, into what some observers accurately described as eternal losers.
Eternal losers. That's harsh.
But perhaps apt. In a profound historical irony, they were ultimately consumed by the very seeds of addiction they had so cynically sown and cultivated in their colonies. It was as if the destructive consequences of their drug policies had boomeranged back upon them, proving to be a poison within their own system, like the snake biting its own tail.
This tragic decline and fall process is particularly vivid when examining the French drug scene, which had deep, direct connections to the French Navy.
The Navy connection is key.
The Asian countries they had colonized were systematically transformed into mere resources for the foreign colonial government. This government, in turn, effectively became the source for military users and addicts within its own ranks.
A direct pipeline.
Opium flowed from the conquered colonies directly into the hands of French servicemen, creating a tragic, self-perpetuating pipeline of addiction that horrifyingly mirrored the imperial flow of wealth and resources.
Looking at the wider context, those addicted military personnel then inevitably brought the problem back to the French homeland, creating a domestic drug crisis.
Bringing it home.
Exactly. There, a new, sophisticated, and socially stratified drug scene began to emerge. Wealthy expatriates could be found openly indulging in opium in iconic places like Le Moulin Rouge.
Seriously. Le Moulin Rouge.
Oh, yes, illustrating the alarming extent to which this colonial vice had permeated French society itself. The problem was not only tolerated but managed and facilitated through an established infrastructure of opium dens and their dedicated suppliers, creating a complete and thriving ecosystem of addiction within La Douce France, the sweet heartland of France.
An entire infrastructure for addiction.
Meanwhile, the colony itself, Indochina, stumbled through its final, agonizing colonial drama, culminating in the infamous mud-soaked defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Dien Bien Phu.
The end point.
A devastating military loss that marked the definitive end of French colonial rule in Southeast Asia. Hashtag #3 early French infiltration and initial struggles in Indochina. Let's turn back the clock a bit. By the year 1800, the British and French had already endured nearly 2 centuries of lethal conflicts across Asia, primarily battling for supremacy around the Indian subcontinent.
A long rivalry.
These were long, bloody, and fiercely competitive rivalries for dominance. After a period of recovery from the devastating Napoleonic Wars in Europe, both powers, now with renewed vigor and ambition, recommenced their eastward push. They gradually began to infiltrate and establish their presence in Indochina and China, seeking new territories, resources, and strategic advantages to exploit.
This wasn't merely a military infiltration, though. It was a deeply intertwined cultural and religious one, woven into the fabric of their imperial ambition.
Missionaries, too.
Yes, they dispatched missionaries who actively propagated a strange, often militant version of Christian belief. Disturbingly, these missionaries sometimes even implicitly or explicitly encouraged the use of opium as a means to gain influence or to pacify local populations.
Wow. Missionaries pushing opium.
It sounds shocking, but it seems to have happened. While the British and Americans were aggressively assaulting China with opium on a global scale, the French, more subtly at first, also began their quiet encroachment into the region, methodically laying the groundwork for their own eventual drug empire.
On their relentless journey towards what some contemporaries darkly labeled the Chinese opium treasure trove, the vast opium transports of the East India Company, alongside those of private country traders and numerous other Arab and Chinese merchants, all had to navigate the strategically vital straits.
The straits were crucial.
To secure these crucial trade routes, the British swiftly established key bridgeheads in places like Arakan, which later became part of Burma, and other essential coastal settlements. They also had the constant task of delivering a steady, immense supply of opium to their primary client in the East Indies, vividly demonstrating the sheer scale and profound reach of this destructive trade network that underpinned so much of the colonial economy.
To smooth this massive venture and cement their logistical advantage, Sir Stamford Raffles famously occupied Singapore, which rapidly transformed into the primary naval and merchant base in Southeast Asia.
Singapore, the hub.
A pivotal hub for British trade, military projection, and crucially, opium distribution. Following Napoleon's defeat in Europe, the British also strategically occupied the Dutch possessions in the East Indies. This move gave them significant leverage in negotiations with the Dutch, effectively compelling them to become more or less loyal allies once the East Indies were eventually returned.
Clever maneuvering.
Very. For the French, however, from their immediate perspective, there wasn't much prime territory left to easily claim in Indochina. As the defeated parties in the major European wars, they were considerably slower to stake their substantial claim on this Indochina cake, despite having initiated their incursions early enough.
So they were late to the party in a way.
Relatively speaking, yes. This slow beginning and their comparatively belated significant territorial claims proved to be a remarkable and, in retrospect, symptomatic foreshadowing of their troubled and ultimately doomed colonial enterprise in the region.
A truly striking aspect of this period in Indochina is that the French already had established relations with local rulers. Their missionaries aggressively propagated Catholic civilization française, often doing so in an arrogant and forceful manner, long before the full military might of France arrived.
That's interesting. Missionaries first.
This is, in fact, one of the rare instances where Western missionaries established a significant presence before overt military occupation truly began, setting a somewhat different kind of precedent for their colonial endeavors.
That's a crucial observation. The military then followed, for instance, into Vietnam, ostensibly to protect the Paris Foreign Missions Society, but in reality to solidify French influence and control, often under the guise of religious freedom.
Classic pretext.
Exactly. The Vietnamese elite, quite understandably, perceived these Catholic priests with their foreign ideologies and social challenges as a profound cultural and political threat to their traditional ways of life. King Minh Mang, the Vietnamese ruler who ascended to the throne in 1820, openly detested these barbarians from the West, viewing them with suspicion and disdain.
Can't blame him, really.
Not at all. Even an influential faction within the dynastic system, the courtesans, actively disliked the priests because they preached monogamy, which directly challenged their social status, traditional practices, and economic interests.
Despite 3 persistent French attempts at negotiation and diplomacy, King Minh Mang remained completely unwilling to conclude a commercial treaty or even to receive a diplomatic letter from the French king. His resistance was unwavering, and he decisively broke off all official relations with France.
Held firm.
As a strict Confucian and a fervent admirer of Chinese culture, he even began to persecute Christianity, a policy that, notably, had been seen in earlier periods of Vietnamese history as well, indicating a recurring pattern of resistance to foreign influence.
What's particularly revealing here is how the First Opium War, waged by the British against China, actually led King Minh Mang to reconsider his firm stance, causing him to contemplate a shift in policy.
The Opium War changed his mind. How?
Perhaps seeing the power dynamic shift, realizing the potential threat. However, he died soon after, and his successor swiftly revived the policy of persecution with even greater vigor, demonstrating the deep-seated, persistent Vietnamese resistance to foreign encroachment.
So the opening didn't last.
No. This Opium War was also a pivotal catalyst for France to fundamentally alter its Southeast Asian policies. They adopted a far more brutal and aggressive approach, mirroring the British. They even sent a warship, coincidentally and darkly named the Heroine, to He in 1843.
The Heroine. Seriously, that's almost too perfect.
Isn't it? A truly symbolic choice given opium's later central role. Following this, they sought a modus vivendi, a way of coexisting peacefully with the English, and astonishingly, even battled alongside their greatest historical rival in the Second Opium War.
Enemies becoming allies over opium.
In a strange and grim twist of fate, opium, the very substance that caused so much devastation and conflict, effectively brought a temporary military peace and, ironically, a period of peaceful competition among the Dutch, British, and French colonial powers as they continued to carve up the region. ##4, military expansion and the unprofitable colonial project.
Much like the Dutch, the French found themselves largely isolated in their significant military adventures across Southeast Asia. Despite being relatively latecomers in some respects, they moved swiftly to establish their presence. They seized Saigon, a strategically crucial port in Cochin China, in 1862.
Saigon was key.
Just a year later, they solidified their control by establishing a protectorate over Cambodia, which critically gave them command of the lower Mekong River, a vital waterway for trade and for accessing the interior regions.
The Mekong. The initial expectation and a major strategic impetus for their expansion was that the Mekong River would provide a direct, navigable route into southern China, specifically into the mineral-rich province of Yunnan.
The route to China's riches.
That was the dream. However, extensive expeditions dispatched to the Mekong sources definitively failed to confirm this navigability, proving the river was not the anticipated gateway to China.
So a dead end.
Pretty much. Consequently, their interest strategically shifted to the Red River, another major arterial waterway. Hanoi was seized in 1873, followed by the acquisition of Lao territory east of the Mekong. By approximately 1885, the entirety of Vietnam, including Tonkin in the north, was firmly under French control.
They moved fast once they got going.
They did. The remaining parts of Laos, west of the Mekong, and the western provinces of Cambodia eventually surrendered to the French in the early years of the 20th century. Their primary imperial challenge, however, remained the largest independent country in the region, Siam, later known as Thailand, which they viewed as a significant barrier to complete regional dominance and a direct route to China.
So how did they approach their expansionist goals regarding Siam? To achieve their objectives there, France went so far as to resurrect and manipulate old, flimsy Vietnamese claims to an Indo-Chinese empire as a mere pretext.
using history as a weapon.
These were tenuous historical assertions at best, but the French twisted them, ultimately fabricating a casus belli to justification for war to intervene in Siam. This deeply cynical maneuver vividly illustrates the opportunistic and morally dubious nature of their expansionist policies throughout the region.
This immediately makes you wonder. Despite all these costly military expeditions, the diplomatic maneuvering, and the aggressive territorial acquisitions, did these ventures actually create a reasonable basis for profitable colonies from a Western perspective?
Yeah, was it actually paying off?
Jacob Iselius, a particularly astute contemporary analyst of Asian Western imperialism, offered a truly devastating assessment of the French inability to effectively colonize wherever their navies and military landed. In hindsight, his prediction of their ultimate failure was remarkably sound. Wazelius questioned whether the admiral who captured Saigon with exceptional good luck in 1862 had any idea that this act would breach the peace among Annam, Siam, and Cambodia, and that in the near future the French weapons should be confronted with the whole of the militant Indochina.
He saw the long-term consequences.
He did. And this brings us directly to the core issue: the opium business. This enterprise was intentionally established and ruthlessly expanded precisely to finance the incredibly expensive French occupation of Indochina, serving as the financial bedrock of their entire colonial project, despite its ultimate unprofitability.
Opium was the only way to make it work, financially.
It seems that way, yes. The engine that kept the whole thing running, however badly.
Among the classical Western colonialists, the French were arguably the last to truly establish and solidify their presence in this part of the world, gaining a firm grip on Indochina comparatively late. And their performance within the opium scene was as dramatic, if not more so, than their political and military endeavors. In the grand sweep of modern history, the French undeniably bear significant responsibility for establishing what would become one of the most powerful and criminally organized drug scenes globally.
A heavy legacy.
Let's delve into how this pivotal and destructive shift occurred, leading to widespread addiction and immense profit.
What's truly striking here is what was considered an important and relatively peaceful innovation in the opium scene, at least from the perspective of the colonizers.
Peaceful. How?
Well, peaceful in terms of administration, maybe. It involved the gradual restriction and then rapid termination of revenue farming, particularly the highly lucrative opium farms. Between 1897 and 1904, specifically in Indochina, the French systematically established state monopolies on the sale of opium as well as alcohol and salt.
State monopolies, taking control.
Exactly. This bold move effectively confirmed and centralized earlier, often fragmented and unsuccessful, local French initiatives to abolish private revenue farming. The direct consequence was a dramatic increase in the financial weight of these consumption taxes, making them the single largest revenue item for the French colonial state, a vital financial lifeline that fueled their administration and military presence.
So this transformation from private revenue farming to a centralized government monopoly, a model that truly took hold in 1882, became a blueprint for all colonial powers across the region. This French general change, as it was sometimes known, swept across Southeast Asia around 1900. But what was the official stated justification for this profound and widespread shift in how colonial governments managed the opium trade? How did they present this radical change to the world and, crucially, to their own populations back home?
The stated justification was remarkably consistent across all European powers, a convenient narrative that thinly veiled their true intentions.
The official story.
They universally claimed the need to reorganize, which, in this specific context, explicitly meant centralize, the entire opium production and distribution process in order to minimize opium consumption.
Minimize consumption.
Yep,
right?
that was the claim. This was conveniently presented as a concession to growing widespread criticisms back home in Europe against their government's involvement in the opium business, which was increasingly perceived as morally repugnant.
So public relations, basically.
Largely, yes. However, looking at the wider context, the actual motives everywhere for this transformation were, first and foremost, far less noble. Colonial bureaucrats simply coveted the immense private profits that mostly Chinese opium farmers were generating, wanting those profits for themselves.
Just wanted the money.
Pretty much. This blatant grab for wealth was consequently accompanied by a generalized racism directed, this time specifically against the Chinese, who had historically dominated much of the private opium trade.
And it wasn't solely the bureaucrats in the colonies pushing for this. The motherlands themselves, the metropolises, were actively pressuring their colonies to become self-sufficient, demanding that they generate enough revenue to cover their own administrative and military costs.
Pressure from home.
Furthermore, they were also insisting on increased exploitation to fund their own military expenses, especially those incurred in the distant Far East, where imperial rivalries were intensifying. It truly sounds like a contradictory struggle of interests where any pretense of moral arguments clashed head-on with insatiable financial demands.
Precisely. In this deeply contradictory struggle between stated ideals and economic realities, the colonial bureaucrats almost invariably prioritized profit. Whatever was publicly claimed about the dangers of opium or the inherent immorality of the business, no influential officials with any real authority truly cared much about the opium consumers, nor about the ethical opinions voiced in the motherlands.
Actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely. The most damning proof of this profound disregard was the astonishing jump in opium consumption that occurred precisely when these opiumergies, these state monopolies, were installed. Far from minimizing consumption, they effectively maximized it for state revenue, turning widespread addiction into a state-managed, highly profitable enterprise. #6. The mechanics of revenue farming and French hypocrisy.
Let's consider how this entire system operated before the shift to state monopolies. In the 19th century, every Western colony in Asia, as well as the independent kingdom of Siam, managed and regulated its opium trade through what was known as a farm system.
The farm system, right.
This wasn't merely a significant source of income. It was, by a considerable margin, their single most important source of revenue. It truly was the financial lifeblood of their colonial administrations.
That's correct. The entire colonial enterprise in Southeast Asia was effectively financed by these revenue farms. Each colony and independent state, in essence, farmed out the majority of its revenues to Chinese tax farmers, who then had the sole right to collect specific taxes or sell certain goods.
Farming out taxes.
Yeah, letting private individuals, usually wealthy Chinese merchants, bid for the right to collect taxes or sell monopoly goods like opium or alcohol for a set period. This prompts a crucial question. Can we truly understand the fundamental nature of European colonialism in Southeast Asia without acknowledging the absolutely central and indispensable role of opium in financing it?
Seems impossible.
The answer is unequivocally no. Opium was the engine, the driving force of their presence and operations.
So, colonies and state private institutions like the Dutch East India Company, VOC, or the British East India Company used these highly lucrative revenue farming systems as their primary means of income. What was the practical alternative to such a system, and why was farming out the opium trade so consistently preferred by colonial powers?
The alternative was to establish a separate, substantial, and incredibly expensive direct tax organization, which would have required a complex, costly, and extensive bureaucracy.
Building a whole tax department?
Right. For foreign occupiers, this alternative carried the significant additional disadvantage of requiring highly unpopular tax collectors, a move that could easily provoke the indigenous population into widespread unrest or outright rebellion. Revenue farms, on the other hand, didn't attract too close a scrutiny from the local populace or even from many European critics, as the financial dealings were often opaque.
Easier to hide things?
And easier to shift blame. European authorities could conveniently and easily blame the Chinese farmers for spreading and extending the opium vice in response to the many complaints that arose from both indigenous communities and later from Western observers, thus deflecting direct responsibility from themselves.
So while opium revenues consistently proved to be the most profitable, income was actually drawn from a wide variety of products and regulations under this farm system. In the British Straits settlements, for instance, there were farms not just for opium, but also for alcohol, gambling, betel nut, pork, pawnbroking, and even markets.
Diversified farming, you could say.
A prime example is Singapore Island, where opium and spirit farms were the largest and most lucrative in British Malaya, often constituting between 40% and a staggering 60% of the entire state revenue.
60%, just from opium and alcohol farms.
60%. This extraordinary reliance on opium was possible due to a strong commitment to free trade policies and, somewhat ironically, a general lack of other readily taxable exports.
The French, too, understood the strategic importance of revenue farms and attempted to implement them. They started on a relatively small scale, endeavoring to collect money in Cochin China. This was later extended to Cambodia and Annam Tonkin, but it largely failed to yield the desired results.
Why did it fail for the French?
As one astute observer, Crawford, noted in 1820, the smallness of their numbers does not admit of the employment of instruments either sufficiently cheap or sufficiently expert. They are but unwilling for and unequal to the task of bestowing the necessary attention to the minute details of a laborious business,
Basically, they weren't good at managing it.
or controlling their own people. In essence, the French were largely unable to effectively control their own subordinates, who frequently kept most of what they collected for themselves, highlighting a profound administrative weakness and pervasive corruption.
That observation, made by a colonial administrator like Crawford, truly speaks to the fundamental fragility of their power on the ground. The very fact that European powers had to rely so heavily on Chinese helped to extract the fruits of their repression, powerfully demonstrated how tenuous and superficial their control truly was.
Absolutely. It was precisely this stark acknowledgement of fundamental weakness that underpinned the so-called indirect rule system favored by the English or the Dutch during the VOC period, where they often governed through existing local hierarchies rather than attempting full direct control, recognizing the limitations of their own reach.
Right. Indirect rule.
Indeed. The institution of revenue farming was also well known in Europe, where rulers frequently employed trusted collectors, sometimes Jewish individuals, to perform this unpopular work, which also aided in the accumulation of capital and solidified a specific, often vulnerable elite.
Tax farming wasn't new.
Not at all. In Asia, however, there simply weren't enough Jewish individuals available for this particular task, as many were already deeply involved in other lucrative ventures like opium smuggling, banking, and shipping between India and China. Instead, a tiny Chinese elite was available and willing to undertake this undesirable job in Southeast Asia, becoming the indispensable middlemen for colonial revenue extraction, often at great social cost.
So it wasn't necessarily the political leaders relied on revenue farming simply to gain more income, as some initially thought. Instead, it was fundamentally about establishing a regular, predictable income stream through taxing people, as opposed to direct colonial robbery by foreigners.
Regular income versus plunder.
Taxing, after all, is traditionally a prerogative of an accepted, legitimate government. But like all colonizers, the French acted as if this was the case, even though foreign colonial regimes were, in reality, only feared and hated by the indigenous populations. Natives only collaborated within socially or economically artificial frameworks, compelled by coercion or economic necessity, not by any genuine acceptance of foreign rule.
The sheer artificiality of this situation becomes glaringly apparent from the absurd fallacies French occupiers used to defend their distribution of opium, which everyone, including themselves, knew to be pernicious and destructive.
The excuses must have been something else.
Oh, they were. Even in the early phase of their Southeast Asian activities, complaints were repeatedly lodged that they were poisoning the indigenous people with their opium. An important official named Dusutur famously responded with astounding cynicism, a chilling confession of deliberate moral abdication. A government which is ahead of the European civilization and which has a true providential mission in these countries cannot be itself the treacherous executioner, le bourreau empoisonné, of these peoples. It is able to sell this task to others and close their eyes waiting for the period in which one could say, "It is enough," and put this announcement on all the borders of Cochin China.
Wow. Just outsource the poisoning and look away.
That's essentially what he's saying. Unbelievable cynicism.
Along with this most cynical form of hypocrisy, there are also incredibly simplistic, almost childish reactions to the mounting complaints. Some officials claim that opium distribution couldn't be stopped abruptly because of severe health hazards, like withdrawal symptoms.
The withdrawal argument.
Conveniently ignoring that this exact moment of abrupt cessation occurred anyway in the next century when the French were forced to leave after the disaster of 1954.
Good point.
Others pointed to the high price of opium and concluded that it was only accessible to the rich people of Annam and the Chinese, somehow rationalizing its use and downplaying its widespread impact.
It's only for the rich, so it's fine.
Pretty much. The argument was also frequently heard, as elsewhere, that only an overdose was harmful, and that one had to be stupid to take an overdose, despite vivid and colorful details being sketched about the utter misery and degradation that inevitably followed widespread addiction. These were transparent, flimsy attempts to deflect blame and responsibility.
And, in a remarkable display of self-serving hypocrisy, even the official publication of the French administration, Le Courrier de Ségon, on March 10, 1864, demonstrated astonishing originality when discussing the current annual budget. It audaciously claimed that the morality of the French administration was proved beyond doubt because, Out of a total budget of 3,012,000 French francs, a full 10% was specifically allocated to propagate the Christian faith and education among those poor opium addicts.
Spending 10% on helping the addicts they created and profited from.
Precisely. It was a truly brazen attempt to sanitize their image while actively profiting from the very addiction they claimed to be alleviating.
Despite these transparent arguments and moral gymnastics, there was almost no actual French supervision of the revenue farms that were established around 1862. This meant that any available data from this period is inherently unreliable, with Chinese farmers' testimonies recorded in French bookkeeping often described as outright falsifications.
So the books were cooked.
Seems likely. And later analyses even revealed that French bureaucrats themselves were actively engaging in fraudulent activities, making the true scale of the opium profits and their distribution even murkier and more deeply corrupted.
For roughly 2 decades, the French seemed relatively satisfied with their opium income, which was derived from several sources. There was the Jandot, which is the prepared, smokable opium, sold for about $1.08 per tael. That's a unit of weight roughly equivalent to 37 grams.
Okay.
Then they profited from the petals of poppy flowers, called écorce. These had nearly no opium residue and were typically chewed by poorer people as a kind of sira, a mild stimulant popular in the region. Yet in 1880 and 1881, significant quantities of these écorces were sold, generating substantial amounts of money, $50,000 and $30,000.
Selling poppy petals.
Yes, even that. They also profited from buying the dross from pipes called taiamphion, which was essentially the residue, and mixing it with the jandot to extend their supply.
Stretching the product.
Classic dealer tactic. Licenses to open an opium den generated another income of about $20,000 a year. Finally, opium was exported to neighboring countries, though the exact amount couldn't be accurately determined from available records, suggesting an even wider and less traceable network of distribution.
So let's track the numbers and witness the staggering growth of this revenue stream. In 1862, the revenue of the French colonial state from opium was a significant $61,334.
Okay, starting point.
This figure skyrocketed to $210,182 just 4 years later, by 1866.
Wow, tripled.
It then increased further to $465,000 in 1873. By 1877, it had reached a staggering $1,337,490, peaking at over $1.7 million in 1878.
Exponential growth.
Throughout this entire period, opium income consistently represented about 20% of the export earnings from rice, which was otherwise the primary source of income for the colony. Clearly, opium was not just a revenue stream, it was a financial powerhouse for the French.
20% is huge.
An opium factory, or boulerie, had already been established in Cholon, near Saigon, by 1874, indicating the increasing industrialization and scale of their drug operations.
A contemporary analysis of the French budgets in Cochin China from 1877 provides a truly detailed financial snapshot. It shows land rent bringing in 3.5 million French francs, accounting for 25% of the total budget income. However, the second main source was a substantial 3.1 million francs, representing 22% of the budget, derived directly from the opium revenue farms.
Opium almost matching land rent.
Exactly. This analysis reveals a fascinating discrepancy as it contradicts slightly different results from another analyst a few years later. This suggests either a significant difference between gross and net income, or more likely points to the pervasive issue of fraudulent bureaucrats, which was indeed a documented and persistent complaint within the French colonial administration, obscuring the true financial picture.
The French, as we've explored, essentially pioneered this new tradition of state-controlled opium, including its inherently ambiguous and morally compromised background.
They set the trend, unfortunately.
The Dutch quickly followed suit, copying this incredibly lucrative model directly in their East Indies colonies. Regardless of the stated motives of the colonizers, whether they invoked pacification or a civilizing mission, a crucial, unspoken truth in all motherlands was that the colonies absolutely had to pay for themselves.
Bottom line, colonies had to be profitable.
This meant their exploitation had to be intensified far beyond any previous levels. This generated revenue was not only intended to cover the costs of colonial administration, but also, critically, to provide regular transfers of money back to the metropolis, the home country, bolstering their own economies.
This systemic demand for colonial self-sufficiency directly explains why opium revenues dramatically increased instead of diminishing through the implementation of the opium regime, the state monopoly.
So the state monopoly actually increased consumption.
Increased revenue, certainly, which implies increased or at least more efficiently captured consumption. This period also witnessed a renewed and significant surge in the military involvement of most colonial powers at the end of the 19th century, driven by intensifying imperial competition and the urgent need to secure and exploit resources.
More military action needed more money.
Exactly. Furthermore, a full industrialization of opium production was realized, with many new, highly efficient opium factories being constructed to streamline the entire process. This was the era where the seemingly benign euphemism pacification was widely employed to describe colonial military actions. In reality, this word covered one of the bloodiest and most brutal periods in colonial history, with extreme violence employed to secure and expand these highly profitable enterprises.
Pacification meant brutal suppression.
Absolutely.
The International Opium Commission in Shanghai in 1909 reported some incredibly telling data that vividly illustrates the sheer scale of opium's financial importance across the region. In 1906, opium provided a staggering percentage of total government revenue in various colonies, 16.25% in French Indochina,
16%, still huge.
29.02% in Hong Kong, a shocking 53.3% in the Straits Settlement,
Over half the budget in the Straits.
10.8% in the Federated Malay States, 14.91% in the Netherlands East Indies, 14.3% in Formosa, 25.7% in Macau, and 15.55% in Siam. These figures are truly astounding, powerfully demonstrating just how widespread and deeply entrenched opium use and the addiction it fostered were across all those countries, a truly pervasive and state-sanctioned vice.
Thinking about the broader implications, the farmers in the old private system, having paid more money to win the franchise for opium distribution, were incredibly eager to cultivate as many consumers as possible, ideally addicts.
Made business sense for them.
From a purely cynical perspective, yes. The insidious tricks still known among drug dealers today, such as selling cheaply or even giving away opium for free to lure people into addiction, were widely employed by them. Critics in the West were certainly impressed by these staggering revenue figures, fully understanding that without these immense incomes, the colonies would be incredibly difficult to finance, including the projects disingenuously framed as the mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission.
So they knew it was bad, but needed the money.
Exactly. So while some form of reform for the farm system was deemed necessary to address rising ethical concerns, its complete discontinuation was never genuinely considered as an option.
However, this farming system did eventually come to an end, but not so much out of compassion for the countless victims or due to rising international criticism. Instead, it was driven by pure, unadulterated greed.
Greed wins again.
It was coldly calculated that it would simply be far more profitable for the colonial state to directly collect the vast profits that the private farmers were making themselves. The colonial decision-makers urgently needed to finance the ever-increasing military, administrative, and luxury costs of the foreign settlers and their expatriates, essentially, to fund their own opulent lifestyles and personal wealth.
Gotta pay for the governor's mansion.
Right from the end of the 19th century, costly and imposing buildings like opulent Western hotels, grand banks, and imposing government palaces rose everywhere, symbols of colonial power. And the white settlers systematically built large villa quarters with excessively grand gardens on the very best land, all lavishly funded by the intensifying exploitation of the colonies and specifically the booming opium trade.
What's particularly striking here is that the French were the very first to transform the private farm system into a centralized opium regie in 1882. And this proved to be an incredibly profitable move, a financial masterstroke from their perspective.
How profitable?
We have clear data showing that in 1882, the net income of the opium regie was 734,949 piastres. While substantial, this was slightly less than the average farm system advantage of 790,684 piastres from previous years.
Okay, a slight dip initially.
But the transition quickly paid off. By 1884, the net income of the opium regie soared to an impressive 1,342,200 piastres, representing a significant financial advantage over the old farm system.
Nearly doubled in 2 years.
Exactly. By 1898, the profits from the opium regie reached an astonishing 2,300,000 piastres, solidifying it as a truly lucrative enterprise for the French colonial state. The total profits generated from this state monopoly system from 1882 to 1898 reached over 18.7 million piastres, a truly massive sum that bankrolled their entire colonial project in Indochina.
And when we examine the sheer quantity of opium involved, the numbers tell an equally compelling story. From 1862 to 1882, under the private farming system, opium purchases remained relatively consistent, fluctuating between 20,000 and 40,000 kilograms.
Okay, the baseline.
But immediately after 1882, the year the opiumbrigi, the state monopoly, was introduced, these quantities dramatically doubled, then tripled, and sometimes soared to an astonishing 170,000 kilograms around 1900.
Whoa, from 40,000 to 170,000 kilos.
A massive increase. There's simply no doubt. The opiumbrigi was indeed an incredibly big business for the French compared with the previous farming system. It was designed not to curb addiction, but to relentlessly maximize state revenue. Moreover, these vast and increasing quantities of opium began to flood Cochin China, aggressively pushing into new markets in the relentless search for new customers, creating an even wider net of addiction to feed the state's coffers.
The French introduced the opiumbrigi in Indochina in the early 1880s, a model that the Dutch then directly copied in their East Indies 20 years later, recognizing its inherent profitability and efficiency.
Others saw it worked.
The centralization of all parts of the opium process, from procurement to distribution, was completed when a single massive opium factory for all French colonies was established in Saigon in 1900.
One central factory for everything.
Yes. This modern factory was an extension of a previous plant that had already been operational in the last years of the farm period, indicating a seamless and deliberate transition to industrial-scale drug production. By 1929, the opium revenue in French Indochina had increased to nearly $8 million, generated from a much smaller quantity, about 140,000 pounds.
More money from less product.
Exactly. This clearly demonstrates the increased efficiency and staggering profitability of the state monopoly as they were extracting significantly more value from each unit of opium sold.
Let's shift our focus to another fascinating, albeit much darker, chapter of French influence. The French concession in Shanghai.
Shanghai. A whole different beast.
Thanks to their military cooperation with the English in the Second Opium War, the French were granted a large part of the international settlement in Shanghai, giving them a significant and strategic foothold in this rapidly burgeoning city. Shanghai itself experienced truly fabulous growth after World War I, with its population almost tripling to 3 million between 1910 and 1930, transforming it into a truly global metropolis, but also a hub for illicit activity.
What's particularly striking here is how the French concession, in particular, became utterly notorious for its exclusive and elaborate entertainment business, which was deeply and inextricably intertwined with the narcotic scene.
The entertainment and the drugs went together.
Hand in glove. This life of vice exploded after World War I. Shanghai swiftly transformed into an overnight cabaret town, a city brimming with expensive nightclubs, opulent brothels, and the like, catering to a burgeoning foreign and wealthy Chinese elite. By 1915, there were officially about 10,000 prostitutes in the international settlement, but just 5 years later, by 1920, municipal authorities estimated there were a staggering 70,000 prostitutes in the foreign concessions alone.
70,000.
With an astonishing 40,000 of them specifically operating within the French concession.
40,000 in just the French part. That begs the crucial question. How did this extraordinary level of vice and crime proliferate so rapidly, and why was it so heavily concentrated in this one area?
That's the million-dollar question.
Chinese observers across the political spectrum widely believe that Shanghai's enormous narcotic, gambling, and prostitution industries depended heavily on the protection offered by the consular system of extraterritoriality.
Extraterritoriality, meaning foreigners weren't subject to Chinese law.
Exactly. This system, established under the unequal treaties of the 19th century, effectively creating havens for illicit activities beyond Chinese jurisdiction. Even the most jaded urbanite was dismayed by the underworld's more violent manifestations, rampant kidnapping, robbery, and homicide crimes committed with impunity by criminals who base themselves within the French concession or the international settlement.
That's right. Observers explicitly stated that if anything socially unsound was discovered in the international settlement, it was immediately removed to the French concession, where it comfortably settled down.
So the French concession became the dumping ground for vice.
Or the sanctuary, depending on your perspective. This indicated a deliberate policy of institutional laxity. The French concession became infamously known as the dirtiest spot in the Orient. It proudly boasted the largest opium dens, the biggest brothels, the fanciest casinos, and the most brazen prostitutes. Critically, the police in the French concession were explicitly doing nothing to stop this immoral traffic. a stark contrast to other parts of the international settlement, where at least some attempts at control were made,
Police just look the other way.
or were actively complicit. The reason for this unique character of the French concession, as indicated by Chinese contemporaries, was the direct consequence of French laxity towards all their colonies and, by extension, towards the native populations they governed. Let the natives go to degradation and demoralization, their fate is no concern of the French nation.
Chillingly blunt.
It is a statement of profound, deliberate disregard.
Corruption within the French concession was truly endemic, reaching even the highest levels of French officialdom. Du Yusheng, the notorious boss of the Green Gang and creator of one of the world's largest illicit cartels, was always intimately connected with high politics.
The infamous Du Xing.
He routinely held conferences with French authorities to discuss and essentially manage gambling and opium operations. He came to dominate the rackets in the French concession under the direct protection of figures like Chief Etienne Fiori and Consul General Coechlin.
Protected by the French authorities themselves.
He even brazenly opened 4 gambling houses, each quietly paying a daily protection bribe of $2,500, which Du himself discreetly passed on to the highest authorities, vividly illustrating the deep complicity that extended all the way to the top.
Du became a true godfather figure in Shanghai, wielding immense power. He was frequently approached by the wealthy residents of the French concession to settle disputes over inherited property, divorces, and other personal problems, which further enriched him and solidified his influence.
The gangster mediator.
And more importantly, he served as a mediator in labor conflicts, giving him a powerful strike weapon in several key labor unions within the French concession, allowing him to exert control over various industries and even daily life. However, news eventually reached Paris, and the French government became deeply embarrassed as the entire French concession appeared to have been openly handed over to Chinese gangsters.
Paris got wind of it.
Complaints first came from the French colonial government in Hanoi, deeply concerned about the reputation and operational integrity, followed swiftly by condemnation in the local press. The French concession police initially responded by simply rounding up the usual suspects, a superficial action that failed to address deep-seated corruption. This was, notably, not the end of the story.
Hostilities with Japan escalated significantly in January 1932, intensifying the geopolitical tensions in the region. In response to the growing chaos, a straightforward French admiral declared martial law in Shanghai and, to everyone's surprise, immediately prohibited gambling and drugs.
A crackdown.
In a bizarre show of defiance and loyalty, Du Yusheng mobilized 1,000 armed gangsters, astonishingly, with tricolored armbands supplied by the French police, rallying in ostensible support of the French Consul General Coechlin, who was linked to Du's operations.
Gangsters with French armbands supporting the corrupt official.
Bizarre, right? However, the French Navy, stepping in to truly restore order, cleared the streets in the French concession of these dubious supporters, leading directly to the resignations of Du Yusheng, Coechlin, and Fiori. A temporary, but significant, victory against a rampant corruption.
Du's revenge for this perceived betrayal was swift and brutal. A month later, during a luncheon ostensibly organized by Du himself, 5 high French officials were poisoned. 4 of them died, including the former Consul General Coechlin. Fiori survived, though extremely ill, and quickly left the French concession to spend the rest of his lucrative, opium-funded life in a luxurious villa in France, effectively escaping justice. Following this shocking incident, large numbers of corrupt policemen in the French concession were finally dismissed and replaced by more disciplined personnel. However, the drug-related crimes then soared to new heights, reaching 6,000 reported incidents in 1933 and an astonishing 11,000 a year later.
Crime got worse after the crackdown,
Demonstrating that merely removing a few key figures didn't dismantle the underlying pervasive criminal infrastructure.
So, what was the response of the new French leadership in the face of this continued crime wave and the public poisoning of their officials? Probably because the poisoning could not be proved in a court of law. They tried to negotiate directly with the godfather Du Yusheng,
Negotiate with the man who likely poisoned their colleagues.
as they were either deeply bribed or perhaps even threatened with murder. Only one practical possibility remained to effectively remove him from the French concession, provide him with attractive facilities outside its boundaries. Thus, negotiations began with the Chinese municipality about what could possibly be offered to Du Xie to entice him to relocate his vast operations elsewhere.
That's a crucial point. What kind of facilities were they discussing? There were a number of small factories, often just a single room, barely large enough to contain a rudimentary laboratory scattered around the French concession.
Little drug labs.
Here, crude morphine, manufactured in eastern Sichuan, was refined into morphia and heroin by a truly international cast of chemists: Chinese, Japanese, German, and Russian. The idea was that if the nationalist authorities, who had been trying once again in 1931 to establish a legal opium monopoly themselves, could be persuaded to come to an agreement with Du Yusheng, then these illicit refineries might be relocated outside the French concession into Greater Shanghai.
Just move the problem somewhere else.
Exactly. This grim episode vividly illustrates how deeply French officials remained entangled in criminal practices, sometimes acting as initiators of the trade, sometimes as direct profiteers, and sometimes, tragically, suffering the dire consequences of their own machinations, as seen with the poisonings. This wasn't merely a tale of corruption, it was a testament to how deeply the pursuit of illicit profit had permeated the colonial state. ###Chagnai-Ux, the bitter end of French colonialism.
After 1930, the influence of both France and Britain in China rapidly faded, quickly superseded by the rising powers of the USA and Japan. But the ultimate humiliation for France truly came with World War II and Indochina itself.
World War II changed everything.
Between June 1940 and March 9, 1945, Japan enjoyed full control of Indochina, shockingly, with the blatant compliance and active assistance of the French colonial authorities.
Wait, the French helped the Japanese occupy Indochina?
Blatant compliance and active assistance. The colony, still nominally under French administration, became Japan's main base for its aggressive southward push against the Philippines and Southeast Asia after the attack on Pearl Harbor. A truly appalling level of collaboration that stained their record.
This specific sentence contains the most serious allegation possible against the French. It was a profound act of betrayal, a betrayal of the Indochinese people who were now subjected to a double occupation, a betrayal of their Western allies who were actively fighting the Axis powers in a global war, and even a betrayal of their own civilization's stated values.
A betrayal on multiple levels.
While other Western powers, like the British and Americans, bravely fought the Japanese in the Pacific, Burma, or the East Indies, often succumbing to superior numbers, the betrayal of the Indochinese people was far more direct and active. It concerned not only the explicit collaboration with the enemy, but, incredibly, during the Japanese occupation, French troops actively fought and suppressed Indochinese resistance movements that were themselves fighting against the Japanese.
French troops fought against the anti-Japanese resistance.
Unbelievably, yes. While other resistance movements sometimes allied with new powers hoping to topple existing regimes, there is no other known example in history of a former occupier actively collaborating with a new occupying power to suppress local resistance against that new power. It remains an unprecedented and deeply dishonorable stain on their historical record.
This entire period culminated in widespread chaos, with various parties desperately trying to save themselves or exploit the fluid and desperate situation as the war concluded. For example, in the ongoing power competition between the British and French throughout Southeast Asia, Siam, by largely remaining unoccupied, served as a kind of buffer between the respective European possessions.
Siam played it smart.
It was strategically renamed Thailand in 1939, and managed to remarkably recapture lost territory after 1945, skillfully navigating the collapse of the old colonial order.
Looking at the wider context, this shift happened about 3 years before the English were finally compelled to flee their realm in India, marking a monumental turning point in global history, and a decade before the French lost their last decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
The dominoes were falling.
The Americans then, quite tragically, inherited the colonial legacy, learned next to nothing from its painful lessons, and were forced to leave Vietnam themselves 2 decades later in a chaotic, humiliating flight with their tails between their legs, decisively defeated by a small, self-conscious, poorly armed, and relatively weak developing country.
History repeating itself almost.
It certainly echoed. This resulted in a deeply disillusioned American citizenry and a military that felt profoundly dishonored, a stark echo of the French experience, highlighting a pattern of imperial overreach and underestimation of local resolve.
And central to this entire narrative is Ho Chi Minh, often rightly called the grave digger of both French and American imperialism in Asia.
Ho Chi Minh, a pivotal figure.
He also played a direct and instrumental role in actively destroying their opium and heroin activities, recognizing them not just as a vice, but as deliberate tools of colonial oppression. Earlier, he had specifically singled out the French opium and alcohol monopolies as two of the definitive outrages of French colonialism, highlighting their destructive impact on the Vietnamese people.
He saw opium as a weapon of colonialism.
Explicitly, the Declaration of Independence of the First Vietnamese Republic in 1945 even explicitly accused the French of trying to enfeeble a Vietnamese race through opium. While the French might have initially dismissed this as mere communist propaganda, historical analysis has overwhelmingly confirmed these accusations, mirroring similar criticisms often justly leveled against the Dutch and British colonial powers for their own roles in the drug trade.
This directly prompts the question, what does all of this mean for the French colonial legacy? From a Western point of view, French imperialism and colonialism were arguably the most dishonorable and humiliating.
Dishonorable is a strong word.
But perhaps accurate here. After actively collaborating with the Japanese during World War II, France audaciously attempted to restore its corrupt colonial power in a most provocative manner, breaking promise after promise made to the Vietnamese people. They then engaged in a highly cruel and brutal war against the Vietnamese resistance.
Trying to turn back the clock after the war.
Exactly. This resistance had formed organically in the struggle against both Japanese and French occupation and clearly represented the legitimate republican voice of the Vietnamese people. It was, practically by definition, a lost cause for France. They were fighting against the inexorable tide of history and popular will, a battle they could never win.
The bitter, inevitable end in Indochina finally came as General Giap's forces were brilliantly trained and ready. Mao Zedong had decisively won in China by December 1949, and the American-guided Cold War had ominously begun, fundamentally shifting the geopolitical landscape and further isolating France.
The world had changed.
The French Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, recognizing the writing on the wall, candidly told the French Parliament in October 1950 that things had simply gone too far not to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh. His reasoning, though remarkably belated and frankly long overdue, was blunt and unsparing.
What did he say?
It is the overall conception of our policy in Indochina which is wrong. It is a fact that our forces are unable to bring about a military resolution, especially since the evolution of the Chinese situation. And it is a fact that our policy of making feeble concessions and then withdrawing or denying them has failed, and now, alas, will increasingly fail to rally the mass of the Vietnamese people to our side.
Wow. A brutal, self-inflicted admission of utter failure.
Pretty much.
Zooming out to the broader historical implications, their defeat in Vietnam was, tragically, not the end of France's controversial role in world politics, nor the final chapter of its brutal colonial legacy.
It continued elsewhere.
They continued their bloody repression in Africa, particularly in the incredibly costly and protracted war in Algeria, which eventually led to their wrenching withdrawal. They also engaged in persistent, often destabilizing interventions in West African affairs, frequently supporting authoritarian regimes. Disturbingly, there are even allegations that they played a dubious and controversial role in the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, with claims of support for the genocidal regime.
Rwanda, too.
The allegations are there. The dark legacy of their colonial actions, particularly those intertwined with the opium trade and the cynical exploitation it represented, cast a long and far-reaching shadow, profoundly shaping their international conduct for decades to come, demonstrating how historical patterns can stubbornly persist. #tag outro.
So we've taken a deep dive into the surprising and often profoundly disturbing history of French colonialism in Southeast Asia. We've uncovered the central and frankly criminal role of opium in financing and shaping their empire. From shifting imperial dynamics and the desperate scramble for resources, to their stubborn refusal to decolonize, and the shocking decadence and deep corruption that fester in places like the French concession in Shanghai, this story reveals a complex web of economic exploitation, profound moral hypocrisy, and devastating human cost.
What's truly illuminating here is how the relentless pursuit of profit, particularly through the state-sponsored opium trade, ultimately corroded the very foundations of the colonial enterprise, directly contributing to its violent and dishonorable end.
The poison within.
Exactly. This raises an important question for you to consider. How does the legacy of state-sponsored exploitation and the profound hypocrisy surrounding it echo in modern challenges of governance, economic inequality, and international relations today?
Good question.
What parallels, if any, can we draw between these historical imperial tactics and contemporary forms of influence or control, particularly in a world grappling with new forms of addiction, illicit trade, and the ever-present temptation of profit over human well-being? It's a history that, despite its distance, still has much to teach us about power, morality, and the long, lingering shadow of addiction across generations.